Let's move to talk about another sector of the anti-war, the sort of right side, libertarian side. So I do want to credit Josh Hawley saying some agreeable things about NATO recently. I'm a little bit suspicious that if Taiwanese membership in NATO was on the table, that he would maybe change his mind on that. But I want to play this Rand Paul clip from earlier in the day because Afghanistan is in a lot of trouble because we have freezed its accounts, basically financial warfare continuing where we've withdrawn. And Rand Paul was asked by Ryan Grimm on Rising about, if we should stop that. And this response was, and to tie back to our sanctions discussion, I think pretty grotesque.
And one real quick question on Afghanistan. You've said you don't want the Biden administration offering more aid to Afghanistan, but at the same time, the administration is holding on to $7 billion in assets that belong to the Afghan government, not releasing them back to the central bank as they were before. Do you think that the Biden administration ought to continue holding on to the Afghan assets or ought to release it back to the Afghan government?
It's probably hard for me to imagine that something we're holding is actually an Afghan asset. We were giving them $50 billion a year. I would think the $7 billion is stuff they owe us. But it also wasn't, it's for a government. This is a government that took over in a military junta. It's not a legitimate elected government. No way in the world would I give them that money. And the thing is we've spent billions and billions, if not trillions there. And I think it's a big mistake. And to reward people, look, as much as I was for leaving the Taliban agreement, they broke every bit of the agreement. They said they wouldn't advance and they wouldn't take cities until we had gone. And they did anyway. So I think they've broken every agreement we had. And I would put that money back in the Treasury. We don't have it to give anyway. I mean, it's, the thing is all it is more borrowed money. So I wouldn't give it to them.
God, I'm sorry. The music at the end is so dystopian, I must say.
Yeah, really. So, what's your assessment of Biden? And again, that is Rand Paul agreeing with Joe Biden's policy of freezing those assets. Tell us your reaction to what's going on in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, well, it reminds me of like Trump being like, why don't we take Iraq's oil? Like that's our oil. Like we took over the country, it should be ours. So like the arrogance of like, that's our money. That people across Afghanistan in a mass degree are suffering acute malnutrition. And Human Rights Watch just about a week ago released a report saying they're on the brink of a nationwide famine. That is the impact of the United States seizing billions of dollars of assets from Afghan banks. Of course, all the money that was looted by the U.S. puppets as they fled the country, that was a lot of money too. The United States and the World Bank have imposed really severe sanctions on Afghanistan, in addition to freezing all its assets and looting all its assets. And of course, that's hurting Afghanistan, already like one of the poorest countries on earth. Of course, that's hurting everyone's social services are collapsing. Everything is collapsing in the country because of the economic warfare of the United States. Rand Paul, this whole like, it's not a legitimate government. They took power in a junta. It's like, this was a negotiated surrender. The United States negotiated their own surrender, and the Taliban actually, protected them on their way out. This whole, they didn't come into cities. They said they wouldn't come into cities until we were gone. If the Taliban didn't come into Kabul before the U.S. was gone, there would have been a lot more attacks like the one we saw that was the deadliest attack of the entire Afghan war for U.S. forces. And it was Taliban doing security, covering the retreat of the United States. But, I will say that, it's funny because Rand Paul, too, he's the one that throughout the entire, when Trump was elected, was like, finally, we have an anti-war president. That was Rand Paul's line, and like bringing the libertarian world into Trumpdom by saying he's the first anti-war president we've ever had. Obviously, a load of BS seeing what Trump did. But I think that Biden's approach to Afghanistan, while it's genocidal, the sanctions regime and the freezing of assets, which just should immediately be released. I mean, like if you don't want to hurt innocent people, release the assets. But they do want to hurt innocent people. I think that the U.S. knew it needed to leave Afghanistan for a long time. One of the reasons that the defeat took so long is because what president wants to take responsibility for a lost war? It was pretty obvious for a very long time that there was no way for the U.S. to leave without a total Taliban takeover. And so, Trump was possibly going to be the person that ended the Afghanistan. I mean, he was saying that he's going to do it. Lots of people were saying he was going to do it. But when it came down to it, he was probably like, do I really want to be the guy that had the big Afghanistan disaster happen on his watch? So he kicked it down the line to Biden. And I think that what the Pentagon wanted to leave, I mean, it was a clear military defeat. They couldn't really sustain it. And they needed to do what Obama came in and did in 2008, which was we need to pivot to Asia. We're bogged down in these wars that we shouldn't be fighting. And the real focus is China. We need to pivot to China. And so the Pentagon very much is on that page, too. So much so that as soon as the withdrawal happened, all the training switched to war with China for people inside the military, and in particular in the special forces. So the Pentagon knew it needed to leave. Of course, it needed a partner to leave, really someone who is going to be willing to be president when it all collapsed into a huge disaster that they knew was inevitable for probably about 15 years of the war. So for Biden, I mean, I don't know how conscious he is about his decisions as a president. I mean, he doesn't seem that. I feel like he was like the perfect person to come in and say, okay, we can continue with the Pentagon's withdrawal plan. I mean, the fact that plan for the U.S. exit was constant through the Trump and Biden administrations. It wasn't the Trump plan. It wasn't the Biden plan. It was the Pentagon plan. They wanted that to happen. And, after so many administrations, Biden was just the one that wasn't going to continue to kick the can down the line. I don't think that's because he's good in any way. Maybe he didn't even know what was happening. But, it was this is the same reason the Vietnam War dragged on for a long time, because no one wanted to take responsibility. None of the generals wanted to say, this is lost. We got to get the fuck out of here. No president wanted to be like, we've lost and I'm going to surrender. And so they just the bulk of the Afghanistan war, after the troop surge that Obama did, the U.S. has been retreating slowly since then for about 12 years, a 12-year-long retreat, paving the way with bodies and limbs of Afghan civilians and, of course, U.S. soldiers as well. And so it was definitely something that's going to haunt Biden for sure. But I think that if there's anything he can do to make it right, it would be just continuing to wage war on the country, through economic means.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a cruelty with the U.S. holding money and preventing essentially international aid from coming into the country too. Of I don't know, creating a scenario where you're like, well, see, you guys thought that the occupation was so bad. Look what happens when the Taliban is in power. And look, of course, the Taliban, extremely reactionary, it is a force, to oppose it if there ever is one. But to deny aid to people, to human beings, because of the government, because of the people who hold power over them, I think is one of the most inhumane things that you can do if your actual goal is to sort of challenge those in power in that society.
I mean, they've just suffered so much for the last 20 years. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, and it's of course the violence has drastically reduced, but the suffering is still catastrophic, and it's because of the U.S. I mean, and it's that's our real legacy there. And this is the fact that it's continuing is really criminal, and warfare by a different means, unfortunately.
So can I ask you, just because we're sort of talking about it both with the history of the anti-war movement in this country with that Rand Paul clip right there. I mean, how can we sort of work through this, right? Because there's a part of me that's like, okay, we want to build coalitions that can challenge the empire, challenge this machine, but you do see where you might be against the war, but if we're coming at it from very different reasons, particularly if you're a libertarian, you're literally just worried about how much it's costing the U.S. Treasury, right? Very, very different perspectives here. I mean, what is the answer here? I mean, is it just that we need to be better at making our case, that we need to be bolstering our numbers in general? Does Rand Paul, for example, represent, a very embedded part of the libertarian movement? There's all of these different, groups that sometimes show up to anti-war protests in my experience. And, when you're there, you're like, okay, well, this is great. We got people in the streets, but then obviously on the other side, in the political movements, we have to ask questions like, well, what do you really want on the other side? And you can see how quickly people who you're marching with one week are the next week, doing this pro-sanctions march, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different components of that. I mean, there's the people in power who pose to be the anti-war Republicans, right? Mm-hmm. Tucker Carlson is the leader, and then other Republican Congress people like Matt Gaetz, they're all anti-war because they're denouncing the Russia stuff. They said we got to get out of Afghanistan, and they use it, but they're all very pro-war with China. I mean, that's also actually their whole rationale for why we should de-escalate with Russia so we can escalate with China. And so those people in no way are potential allies at all. Like if you're just saying, let's not go to war here, let's go to war there, or let's increase sanctions, that's not, that's not serious for people who look at the world like we do. I mean, there's the general question of like libertarians. I mean, do they have a place in the anti-war? Like I joined the anti-war struggle when I got out of the military in 2005, 2006. Of course, there was libertarians coming to the anti-war demonstrations and libertarian groups or whatever mobilizing for them, and that's great. That's cool. In terms of like the giving political leadership and character to struggles that we build, though, unity is like built on principles, and coalitions are built on principles. And how do you actually reach the broad sectors of working class and oppressed people that you need to build a strong anti-war movement? And of course, that involves addressing racism as kind of a first and foremost thing, and the understanding that these wars are racist wars and have racist components to them, and issues of economic inequality, and that how that's the wars are just a boon for the military-industrial complex while working people suffer and things like that. And so those are kind of points of unity that coalitions, real vibrant working class coalitions, are built around, that like the anti-war right can't be a part of. And it's like going back to this idea about like liberals and anti-imperialists like splitting, which was always the desire of the liberals to split. Like the anti-imperialists into our coalitions always tried to make concessions to the liberal wing, but it was the liberals that we don't want these communists in any kind of leadership position here. But I think that if we're looking about like uniting with people like Rand Paul and Tucker Carlson to build an anti-war movement, I mean, how are you going to get people to join that who are immigrants, who are African American, who are of the LGBT? Like there's so many important groups of people in this country represented by strong and powerful organizations that you want to build coalitions with, that rightfully so could not accept that and should not accept that. So it's always like there's always this hypothetical of like, can we build a left-right anti-war coalition? Like, and that's like, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with reaching the people that aren't reached by either right now.
Yeah.
Like there's, like the anti-war right, this like whatever niche.
Well, so I mean, I'm sorry, like,
sector of the
I'm trying not to
Republican
cut you off, but like, I
Party.
feel like a bit of that is like a bit of a misnomer too, right? In the sense that, like, there's people who like, I mean, I was talking to some friends about this the other day. I meet people, because I'm in Texas, I'm in the South, so like a lot of people that they're not, I don't know, like, they don't want to be left because of the aesthetics of it, right? But there's a lot of people who like generally like they're anti-war, they're against these things. It's like they might say that they like a Ron Paul character, and literally it's because he's anti-war. So I always say that like, well, we should be doing, instead of being like me being like, well, Ron Paul, I love Ron Paul, he's my boy. So it's like, well, here's like a really strong growing movement of like people like us who are doing anti-war. I don't know.
Who take your concerns seriously.
Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about any kind of hypothetical like left-right alliance, I would say, what you're really talking about is the people. Like I don't need Rand Paul to show up at my meeting. Frankly, I wouldn't want him to, unless he's with his neighbor. But like I'm much more worried about maybe some of the normal people who I've seen in my community might get into somebody like a Rand Paul because, he's anti-war, and just bring them to our side that is like much more committed to an anti-war, internationalist, anti-racist position. Yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, and this is like a thing, like there's always been this like right-wing isolationism as like a foreign policy where they think that it's all about America. It's like the America First stuff, which Trump just used in his rhetoric, but still bombed like every place that he could to the 10 times what his predecessor did. And right-wing isolation is all about like we don't want our good American boys going over there and dying to like help these ungrateful people. Then we should like stuff like that. But we want to promote internationalism, not just we shouldn't send our boys to go die, but the idea that we have a lot in common with the people that we're told are our enemies. We have a lot in common with people in China, in Russia, and everywhere else, in Iran, in Cuba, in Venezuela, all the places we're told are our enemies. We have far more in common with them than like extremely, extremely rich people like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and people like that. Like those are people that we actually have nothing in common with at all. And I think that's something that resonates much more with this idea that why would we go help people in Iraq and waste our American blood helping people in Iraq and playing into that lie when we can, help people here. I think it is impactful and meaningful to people to feel that that they're part of a class that is global and they have kind of common enemies, the people who aren't part of us.